All right, hey folks. Today I want to talk about the latest resurgence of high intensity training, HIT training. It seems like every 5 or 10 years there's this resurgence of Menzarian or Yates HIT training, and we're seeing it right now. Loads of stuff all over the place. A lot of it coming from TikTok, but it seems to seep into every area of social media. So I wanted to explore that a bit more. In this video, I want to give you my opinion on some of the pros, because it's not all bad. There are a lot of positives. People aren't just stupid. There's a lot of reasons why they might like doing it and actually get pretty good results. Also some of the negatives, and I guess some take homes from you guys on what to bear in mind if you decide to go down that route. So firstly, I want to talk a bit about the grassroots culture of high intensity training in this country, in the UK, which I think mostly came from Yates in the 90s. Now I know this because where I come from, where I grew up, was about an hour away from Dorian Yates' original temple gym. So the cool thing was, coming up in the 2000s, all the big meathead gyms around here were basically created for Dorian's training. So they all had the pull-over machine, the single arm pull down, the bicep curl machines, all the stuff that Dorian liked to do was all equipped for, because people loved it so much. And so right the way through the 90s, when Dorian was competing and winning, up until the point where he retired, there was just this huge culture of high intensity training, and it was all people did. That's how they trained. Now the problem with that is, when Dorian quit bodybuilding, he didn't just back down. He just left. He went party for a few years, then just did some other things. Now the issue with that is, his training views never really had the chance to evolve. So some of the short reflections that we did have from Dorian about his training actually showed some quite reflective changes. I seem to recall in an interview he did once, he talked about how he probably wouldn't extend sets past failure if he was on a contest prep, because he believed that was part of the reason why he got some of his injuries. We did see shades of reflective Dorian as he got older, talking about his training in the old days. Now, there wasn't much of that though, so his training reviews never really had the chance to evolve. Now, because he never really had the chance to evolve his views, they were written in stone, and they formed people's identities, because they were seen as this immutable law, or this immutable set of principles which you couldn't change, because no one did. Dorian had that in place. This is how he trained, and that was it. There was no evolution of the method. There was no questioning things. And you see this when you interact with a lot of these HIT guys around here. If they question something, if they question what you're doing, and you say, this is why I'm doing this way, and they're like, well, that's wrong because Dorian did it differently. Like, the amount of times I've had those conversations with people over the last 25 years, less and less these days, but certainly in the early days when I was younger, when I was smaller, people would just come up to me and say, hey, why are you doing it this way? Why are you doing multiple sets? Why are you doing this? And I'd say, well, it's because I'm training for this goal, usually because I was a powerlifter. And they would always come back with, well, that's not the way to do it. And I'd question them. They'd say, well, it's because Dorian did it this way. That was it. That was the answer to every question. So it becomes like an identity, a very immutable identity, which you're not really supposed to question. And also what tends to happen is, because that is then seen as people's identities, it then starts to create this groupthink, and it then gets propagated by other guys. So some guys will teach other guys who will teach other guys, because I was taught how to train in a Dorian Yates way by one of those guys. Now, had I taken that on as an identity, well, maybe I would be sat on here on YouTube talking about high intensity training and how great it is 25 years later, a lot smaller and a lot weaker than I was. But in any case, I think it gets propagated and you get this group thing that happens, and it tends to escalate because it's never questioned. It's not supposed to be questioned, and people take it on as an identity, and that identity gets passed down. And here we are 25 years later and we still have to deal with it because we can't question it. In a lot of ways, it seemed to survive a lot of the criticism because of those reasons, because you really weren't supposed to question it. And I think the other reason is, certainly around here, it fits the narrative very well. Where I come from, this area, it's very much a working man's area, traditionally speaking, a lot of coal mines, and people prize hard work above everything else. So something that is difficult to do, is seen as better inherently than something which is easier to do. So people value hard work. So anything which is taken to the limit is generally seen as better. And in the 90s, if you're going to do something which is as narcissistic as bodybuilding, I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but that's the view that people have of bodybuilding. It's very narcissistic. If you're going to do something which is that narcissistic, you almost have to make up for it by being this hardcore train to failure guy, because yeah, okay, I'm doing bodybuilding, I look in the mirror at my muscles, I oil myself up, but actually, you know what? I work really hard, so give me a break. That forms part of the culture, because a lot of these guys, they have that insecurity, this insecurity which runs alongside their love for bodybuilding. They want to bodybuild, they like what it does for their physique, but at the same time, there's this insecurity of, I'm supposed to be this hard working man, but I'm looking at my physique. It's a bit of a hard contradiction to come to terms with. And I think the way they do that partly is by having this I train hard mantra, which they repeat to themselves over and over again. It gives them this chance to look down on anybody that doesn't work hard, because they can feel like they're better than them, because it's part of their identity, right? Anyway, that's a bit about the history of how I feel the HIT stuff got propagated over here where I am in the UK at the grassroots level. Now let's look at some of the positives, okay? I think first of all, what is a positive of this HIT kind of meme coming about is that when people are new into training, buy-in is really important. Somebody who believes in a program and is more willing to stick to it is generally going to get better results. I mean, I know that as a coach. When I first started coaching, like back in the early days, like 10 years ago now, I did occasionally get clients who just didn't really believe like in my abilities, and they almost always got worse results because they were just not committed to the routine. Faz says this, but does Faz really know what he's talking about? Maybe I'll do this and this. And in the end, they get worse results because they're not bought in. If you buy into a program, you do everything to the nth degree, or as best you can with your resources and the time you have. And that's always going to get you better results, because sticking to a routine is going to get you better results than constantly flip-flopping and changing. So there is a positive here. If you are a HIT advocate and you're in the comments now and you're like, yeah, I get great results, cool. I'm not arguing with you. I think buy-in is very important. And if you believe in your training, you're definitely going to get better results. I think there is another positive as well, and that is that when you're new to training, if you're a beginner, I think it's probably a good idea to explore the limits of what you can do. So either that's training hard or training long. I think it's probably quite good, and I think it's probably quite normal that you do. For example, bodybuilding and powerlifting, that's all about pushing your boundaries. And generally what I saw in the early days, the guys who were either competitive bodybuilders or who were powerlifters looking to get stronger on the squat, bench, and deadlift generally got better results. And a lot of powerlifters got better results because they had no other distractions. They had a singular purpose to get stronger at 1 rep max on the squat, bench, and deadlift. I mean, that was me. That was me. I had zero interest in bodybuilding, but I actually built quite a good physique just focusing on powerlifting and just being interested in improving my squat, bench, and deadlift and doing my accessory work. Great. So I think it's good to explore the limits of your boundaries. Like, what can you do? Can you work hard? And I think every time I've stepped up in my physique, it has generally been as a result of working harder or longer. So I think there's a lot of positives there. And I think also, maybe one last thing, let's take the average person nowadays in 2023. If you are somebody who hasn't had a very athletic background, okay, you've grown up, you've not really done that many sports, apart from maybe just school curriculum sports, which is a pretty watered down version of sports, right? So you've never done that. You've always been very academically inclined. And now you're at work, you work in an office job where the majority of the time you're spent sat down in front of a monitor and you're on a keyboard. You're probably not going to be very good at pushing yourself. I think a lot of those people have maybe been exposed to other types of sports, like cardiovascular sports, like maybe running, I don't know, football, like soccer. And the goal in running or football or any event like that is to get to the end, right? That's the goal. If you're running a 5K, the goal is to pace yourself so you can get to the end. If you're playing a football match, You want to pace yourself so you can do all 90 minutes. The goal isn't to just burn out all the way. So I think for the average person starting now, who perhaps hasn't had a very athletic background, hasn't really pushed hard in sports in this way, I think what HIIT training can do is open their eyes to actually working harder, not just trying to pace themselves to get through a session. Because I think a genuine worry for me as a coach is when I get some new guys who don't have an athletic background and also have maybe only really been exposed to team sports where it's timed and they have to make it to the end. They have a very poor understanding of what it means to push yourself hard for 30 seconds or 45 seconds, however long a set's going to last. So I think if HIIT training does anything good, is it does teach people how to work harder. And I think for a lot of guys who are really exploring HIIT training and getting good results, that's probably a good reason as to why, which is a good thing. I think that's great. I'm all for that. Now, in terms of the negatives, I think in terms of the negatives, it's mostly centered around HIIT being this identity. And when you identify with something, it can lead to you being blind to the potential negatives. I think if you identify with a training philosophy, it can lead you to be blinded to some of the negatives and how you can improve on those for you as an individual. A great example of this, people being blinded and really bought into training, was this old Mike Mentzer quote. The quote went something along these lines. I'm paraphrasing. He said, "It only takes one bullet to kill a man. Why would it take more than one set to stimulate hypertrophy?" Yeah. So that should give you a bit of an insight into like the intellect of Mike, because a lot of people think he's a really clever guy, but to say something like that with a straight face and for people to believe that, accept it, you really have to be bought in, because it takes just about 30 seconds of critical thinking to realize that's just nonsense. I mean, it's insane. You could apply that to lots of things. There are 12 slices in a whole pizza. Why would it take more than one set to stimulate muscle, right? It makes no sense. It makes no actual sense. There are 2 doors in a house to get in. Why would you need more than one set to stimulate muscle? Like, none of it really makes any kind of sense. It's the kind of thing where if you are already very brought into the philosophy, you think, yes, one bullet to kill a guy, one set to stimulate hypertrophy. It would make sense on some kind of level, but until you stop and think about it and realize actually that's complete nonsense, it doesn't really make any sense. So anyway, I think that deep buy-in, which can be a positive in some circumstances, can also be a negative, because it can blind you basically to some of the negatives and the downsides, and potentially individualizing the training for you, which is really important. Now, just to kind of segue off into another direction, part of the whole thing about identity is also the visual displays that we see on TikTok. And this is something which became very apparent to me when I was researching the video, because as I was looking through TikTok and exploring some of these HIIT people putting up their training, it very much reminded me of the early days in the 2000s and watching people train at the gym, like some of the bigger guys, some of the older guys. Because as part of the identity, the whole thing becomes a theatrical display. I saw it back in the day when I was watching some of these advanced guys lift, and I actually thought it was cool as hell back then. But I was a kid back then. Now I look at it and I think, yeah, it's a little bit fake and it's a bit cringe. And if you see this on TikTok, you see a lot of this over-exaggerating, hyped up, running around, screaming, shouting, like swearing between reps, like slapping each other around and stuff. You see this whole massive display. And I'll be completely honest, I did a bit of that when I was younger. I can specifically recall when I was lifting weights, doing this real sort of theatrical act of walking up to the bar with tightening my belt, getting real crazy, even just like shaking the bar a little bit. And I felt like I needed that to deliver maximum training intensity. But if I was being very honest with myself, it basically tired me out. So I was trying to do a maximal set, and the theatrics that I was doing before the set and during the set actually weren't helping. They were tiring me out. And I got to the point where I stopped doing all that, and all of my focus became internal, and I was internalizing all that aggression and all that focus. And that is what allowed me to work harder. I mean, if you've got a guy who's 200 pounds and pretty strong, who's running around screaming his head off and screaming in between sets, that's only going to result in a net reduction of training intensity. It's not going to make it easier. It's going to make it harder. You're going to gas out. For a 1 rep max, maybe you could argue it's okay, but these performative sort of theatrical displays end up tiring you out more. And if you look at truly advanced lifters, they're not doing that stuff. The really advanced guys are internalizing the focus. That's what they're doing. It's one of the tells that I know when people are faking it. Some of the stuff that I see on TikTok, it's really theatrical. And that kind of stuff is almost always going to be a net negative. It's going to tire you out. People are wearing this badge of intensity. Again, it's part of the identity. As a result, they get these negatives which seep in, such as tiring themselves out on hard sets, as well as blinding themselves to potentially individualizing training a little bit more than just a ready-made philosophy that they can fit into. I think that's part of it, and it can lead to this split focus where you're focused more on the identity and more on this living the life than you are about critically thinking about what you're doing, maybe doing things which might be a little bit better for you. That's why I stopped doing all the theatrics, because I applied a bit of critical thinking, and I thought to myself, yeah, Faz, you're not helping yourself here. You're just tiring yourself out. And so luckily for me, I wasn't really attached to that style of training. And so I let it go. I started to internalize my focus, and that led to better results. So I think another consequence of forming an identity when it comes to lifting, whether that's high intensity training or whatever it is, I think around here, certainly I've seen it lead people to drugs. Because what tends to happen is, because you are locked into this identity and this way of training, nothing else seems viable. In fact, you might actively look down upon other training methods. You might look down upon people who don't train to failure. Now, as a result, that can lead to drug use. Because I know quite a lot of these guys around here, certainly, when they're not getting the results they think they should be getting, rather than look at the training, because again, the training is immutable, you can't change it. Rather than question things, they resort to drugs. Now, some of the guys that I know around here who have gone down that path, they're more than happy to tell you that high intensity training is the key to their gains, even when they're on cycles of gear. So in their heads, they can't question the immutable HIT principles. And so if they take drugs and they start getting results again, of course, because of the drugs, because previously they were stalled out, in their heads, that's acceptable because the training style they're doing works. And I say that with quotation marks. So it's a very dangerous way of thinking. If you really lock yourself into a training philosophy, one, you're not going to evolve because you basically said, that's it. My training knowledge has capped out. I'm done. I can't evolve. I can't individualize. It's all done. As a result, you may stall. And when you stall, it becomes a lot easier to do stupid things like take a bunch of anabolics and match that in with your perspective of, okay, it must be the training. It's finally working, and minimize the role of drugs. And I think that probably happens a lot more than you think. So now let's move on to just concluding this chat and my final thoughts. So I've given you some of the pros, some of the cons. I think, as I say, the biggest danger is just forming an identity and getting detached from results, because results are really all that matter. If you want to get yourself a t-shirt saying high intensity training, a mustache like mine, so you like Mike Mensa, then cool, go ahead and do that. But at the end of the day, you should still be open to changing your training and individualizing it if things stop working. And that's really the big message. Now, in terms of just summarizing some of the pros, I think there's a lot of benefit to working harder in the gym. Certainly when you're just starting out, I think it's very important to work hard. I think it's very important to explore the boundaries of how much you can do and how hard you can work. I think that's very cool. But I think if you're the type of person who is drawn to a philosophy of training, like HIT training, rather than a set of principles which can be changed and adapted, and there's never any consideration about individualizing things, I think if that's the case, you're probably still quite new in your lifting journey because you haven't yet discovered the more overriding principles like intensity, frequency, and volume, and the interplay of sets and reps, training splits, you probably aren't yet ready to tackle that level of complexity. And so you look for simple answers. And that's okay for a while, but the problem with simple answers is at a certain point, it stops working, because sometimes as you get stronger, training requires complexity. I think it's nice that it can appeal to simplicity, but you have to be open to exploring changes when they're needed. And I think if you wear whatever your training philosophy is as a badge of honor, as a badge of pride, it becomes very difficult to critically think. And this was brought home with the recent power building video. It was a 30-minute video talking about power building and some of the downsides, and not one person managed to actually provide a rebuttal, an actual sensible, logical rebuttal based on what I said. And so that tells me something. I mean, the majority of people love the video, very supportive of it. A couple of guys actually removed the word power building from their profiles and don't talk about it anymore. But quite a few people were still very angry and had this visceral reaction. And that tells me it's a lot like this HIT fad, because they wear it as an identity, a badge of honor, and they don't want to critically think about any possible questioning. As soon as they hear questioning, they get angry, because they're not yet at the point where they're able to critically think about the greater factors involved, like intensity, frequency, volume, splits, all that kind of stuff. So I think that's fine to begin with, but understand at a certain point, you're probably going to run into a wall, and you're probably going to need to think a little more deeply about what you're doing in the gym. I think for me, the bottom line is effort is more important. Hard training doesn't always just mean train to failure. Sometimes it means doing more work, having a balance. I think the problem with HIT training is hard training or effort gets abbreviated into train to failure or beyond failure as shorthand. And that then has the consequence of people getting sucked into this way of training, and people thinking that anything less than training to failure is easy, when that's just not the case. There's plenty of hard training to be done with a balanced level of intensity and more volume. For me, really, it all ties back to results. Do what you need to do to get results. Don't get zealous about a training philosophy, a training style. Be open-minded and understand that everything works for a while, but ultimately you need to have more mastery of the principles of training for you to ensure that you continue to progress. No one method is going to get you to the end destination, because one method is only an insight into that method's interpretation of intensity, frequency, volume, sets and reps, all that stuff. Your needs will change as you grow bigger and stronger. It's just the way it is. So don't limit yourself. Okay, I am going to call it there. Hopefully that was an interesting insight into what I think about the latest HIT trend and my thoughts about how far it can get you and potentially where you might need to be open to change. Right, folks, have a great day, and I will speak to you real soon.